Hey, welcome in. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the most impactful Christian hard rock and metal releases of 1986.
Rocking you up for Jesus Christ with classic style hard rock music and practical Bible teaching.
To this point in this series, I've released 4 other videos talking about the releases from 1978 all the way up through 1985. If you're a Christian hard rock and metal fan, you know there were some incredible releases during those years, so if you missed any of those videos, I encourage you to go back and check them out. In 1986, I had not yet surrendered my life to Jesus Christ, so a lot of these releases I'm going to mention here, I wasn't even aware of at the time that they were released. I was up to my eyeballs in secular metal in 1986, and if you were into that scene, you know there was a ton of it. These were the years when heavy metal bands with big hair and big guitars and big drums were dominating MTV and the radio airwaves and packing out arenas around the world. But God was busy in these years in the Christian metal world, man. He was raising up some metal warriors and they were putting out some amazing records. And the releases of 1986 were kicking the doors wide open for some awesome releases that were going to come in the next years. I would submit my life to Christ the following year in 1987, and God was going to lead me through some doorways and introduce me to some of this amazing music. So I am so excited to talk about some of these releases. Just before we dive into this, man, I want to remind you that I have released tons of Pastor Brad classic style Christian metal rock albums since 2004. And right now I want to highlight just one of them. In 2019, I released an album called Rock This World. 10 original 80s classic style hard rock / melodic metal songs guaranteed to rock you up, man. You can find them wherever you listen to music. Add them to your playlists. Grab the link and share them with friends. Download them. It's an awesome way to support the Pastor Brad Rocks channel and this ministry. Thanks so much in advance, man. All right, let's dive into the best Christian hard rock and metal albums of 1986. I've got 7 releases I want to talk about, plus several honorable mentions. These are in no particular order except for the last 2 because they had a particularly personal impact on my life. Number 1, Messiah Prophet, Master of the Metal. This album from start to finish is the epitome of 80s melodic metal. Every song is just classic, melodic, riff-based, everything we love about heavy metal. One of the standout tracks is called Heavy Metal Thunder. I mean, you can't get a better title than that. If you haven't heard this album, I encourage you to look it up, man. If you can't find it anywhere else, I know you can on YouTube. Messiah Prophet, Master of the Metal. The second release I want to tell you about is the debut album for a band that is clearly in my top bands now. I love these guys. The only reason this album wasn't reserved to the end is because I really didn't discover them till a little further down the road. I'm talking about the debut release from Barren Cross, Rock for the King. This album is heavy. It is classic. The production is top-notch. It was produced by Dino and John Elefante. It's filled with hooks and riffs and power. The writing is awesome. A couple of the real standout tracks from this album, in my opinion, are Dying Day and Rock for the King. With Mike Lee on vocals, Jim Laverty on bass, Steve Whitaker on drums, and Ray Paris shredding on guitar. Barren Cross is a quintessential metal band. I'd put them up there with anybody. Occasionally, Michael Lee would be compared to Bruce Dickinson, and while that didn't hold true on every Barren Cross song, man, it sure does on Dying Day. Go check that song out. If you're a metal guy, you're going to understand what I'm about to say. There were lots of flavors of metal, even in the early and mid 1980s. There was glam metal, there was thrash, speed metal, variations like that. I mean, I know today there's like 73,000 flavors, but back in the day there was still variances. But then there was just heavy metal, straight ahead metal. I would put bands like Iron Maiden in that category, and I would put bands like Barren Cross in the Christian genre in that category. It wasn't about glam, it wasn't about hairspray, although I'm sure they used their share of it. They just cranked out solid, straight ahead metal music. Rock for the King. It was an awesome debut album, Barren Cross, 1986. Next, I want to talk about Daniel Band's release this year, Rise Up. Classic Daniel Band, awesome writing, hooks, riffs, melodies, guitar solos, big choruses. This was Daniel Band's 4th release, and they were on a bit of a trajectory. They started off as rock, and it felt like they got a little bit heavier as things went on. On Rock came out in 1982. Straight Ahead was released in 83. Run from the Darkness came out in 1984, and Rise Up came out in 1986. And with each release, while they maintained that classic Daniel Band rock, right down the middle vibe, by the time they got to Rise Up, man, they were borderline being put into that metal category. I was listening to a Heaven's Metal podcast recently, and one of the guys on there was talking about how Daniel Band, by the time this album came along, they had noticed that their live performances, the songs that were heavier, got a better response from the audience. And in the video that I just made about Immortal Fest, where I was blessed to see Daniel Band live, I noticed that live they sound heavier. hear. And it's a good thing because they sound really good when they rock like that. So the band had kind of noticed this themselves and they wanted to capture a little bit more of that heavy sound on this album, which they absolutely did. If you haven't heard it in a while, go look up this album, Daniel Band, Rise Up, and listen to track 1, Bethel. It will absolutely have you banging your head, dude. Next, another through-the-roof awesome classic band, Bloodgood, came out with their debut album in 1986, self-titled Bloodgood. This album is incredible, I think, from start to finish. I mean, with Michael Bloodgood on bass, J.T. Taylor on drums, David Safiro on guitar, and Les on vocals, how can you not rock? Little side note, I personally think David Safiro, in some circles, is underrated. If you haven't really taken the time to go down the rabbit hole with David Safiro, this guy is right there with Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, all those guys. Go back and check out his solo album. It's the one, I forget the title of the album, but I'll go find the artwork and I'll put it up right here, okay, so you can check it out. I'm pretty sure it's the one that has the cut I See Red on it. Oh my goodness, it's got some instrumental stuff that'll just blow you away. He's incredible. I was privileged to see Bloodgood in 1989 in Indianapolis. I was in a little Christian band at that time. We called ourselves Blueprint. We drove down to Indy. I think it was kind of on a whim, like we heard last minute that they were going to be in this little theater. It was like one of those old movie theaters that sat maybe 400 people, the classic balcony and the stage, and then they'd show the movie in those old style theaters, and it was awesome. And then of course I was so blessed when Bill Baffert of Rocks Records connected me with Les, and he ended up singing on my song, He Loves Me, and then to meet him at Immortal Fest and experience his gracious spirit, his kindness in person, super cool. Bloodgood's 1986 self-titled debut album kicked some doors open for Christian heavy metal. Awesome release. Next, Bride released their debut album in 1986, Show No Mercy. The production's a little bit raw, but it's got that classic hard rock, from the heart, gut level groove that Bride has always been known for. This album, it just has all the classic trademarks of a Bride release. Great writing, incredible attitude, power, passion, super cool. All right, now we're down to the final two, man. The first of the last two that I want to share with you is Saints 1986 Time's End. Now, if you've been part of the Pastor Brad Rocks family, you've heard me talk about this album a lot because I've been breaking down every song from the album in terms of the message and the lyrics, and the biblical content. And one of the reasons this album means so much to me is because the year I surrendered my life to Christ in 1987, I was living out in Wichita, Kansas. I had left central Indiana to go live with some family out there, specifically for the purpose of getting away from the environment of all my partier friends and all the stuff that was, just a bad influence on my life, just making a fresh start. Surrendered my life. I was just living out there kind of indefinitely. I had this job where I was a parts runner for a mechanic shop. I'd run around and pick up parts for them and stuff. And one of my breaks, I went into the Christian bookstore and I'm looking for Christian metal. And I don't know what it was like where you grew up or what kind of Christian bookstores you had, but Christian metal was hard to find. So I'm flipping through all the albums and the cassettes, and I see this. Dude, I was going to buy this album sight unseen, but of course back then they would let you listen to it, so I dropped it in, and of course I heard this, man, and I was like, dude, bought it, dropped it in my Sony Walkman, and rocked out non-stop. Every song just jammed. And then, of course, years later, to stumble onto a relationship with Richard Lynch. I don't even remember exactly how it worked out. I sent him one of my albums, and he wrote back, and we began to exchange emails. And the next thing I know, he and Dee Harrington, who was the main guitarist during their Too Late for Living release, incredible shredder, man. I connect with both of those guys. They end up laying tracks on several songs on Reshredded. You talk about a dream come true. Richard and I talked a lot on the phone during that time. He is such a down-to-earth, super gracious guy. And then to have the opportunity this past September at Immortal Fest to finally meet Saint. Granted, it was a new incarnation of the band. I think Richard, I know Richard was the only original member in this picture, but wow, what a cool experience that was. God has used Saint tremendously in my life. Now, specifically, I'm talking about those early first three releases up through Too Late for Living. I like their other stuff too, I really do, but it was those first three, really just Time's End and Too Late for Living, that really impacted my heart, man. One other piece of trivia that I just came across today, and man, did this turn on some light bulbs for me. The last song on the album is called Steel Killer. When I was working on my video for this song, breaking down the lyrical content and pulling in the biblical truths that I see expressed in these lyrics, I'm like, what is this steel, this metal killer? What has that got to do with anything? And I mean, it's clear as you read it that they were personifying Satan as a steel, a metal killer of some kind. It's like, well, okay, I mean, I guess it's heavy metal, whatever. I just rolled with it, put it in the category of art and said, cool. I mean, it's still a cool spiritual lesson. Then I discovered today, as I'm doing my research, that this song was actually originally written about German submarines in World War II being steel killers. I don't know how the lyrics around that theme were different originally and how much they had to tweak it to kind of make it work for the way the final product turned out. But Pure Metal, who was the label at the time, said, no, we're not going to have a song on your album about a World War II German submarine. There was a real push during this time. You might think it's healthy or unhealthy or whatever, but for every song to be strictly focused on Jesus and on Christianity in the Christian metal world. I appreciate that on one level, keeping the guardrails up. Let's stay focused on the main thing. But in some ways, it kind of restricted bands from being able to just address life subjects from a Christian perspective as much as maybe they would have liked to. A good example of this is Barren Cross. Their first album is really focused in that way on strictly just biblical Christian themes, but as they went on, they talked a little bit more about life issues from a Christian perspective, like Killers of the Unborn. That's a great example. I also heard from a brother on a Heaven's Metal podcast, and he said he was 90% sure that this was accurate. He said he heard that Pure Metal gave the band $10,000 to do the record in 1986, but they ended up doing the album for $4,000 and taking $6,000 and reinvesting it in gear and things that they needed for the band moving forward. Now, having spent some time talking to Richard Lynch, who has a business mind and he's very practical and entrepreneurial minded, that doesn't surprise me at all. And when you think about the fact that this whole album was recorded and mixed and mastered for $4,000, wow, all of a sudden it sounds even better. And so this 1986 release, Time's End, with John Mahan on guitar, Josh Kramer on vocals, Richard Lynch on bass, and Brian Willis on drums. It will always be one of my favorite releases ever. And then the final album. If you're a Christian metal guy, and if you've been looking at the shirt that I'm wearing right here, you know which album I'm going to be mentioning right here, okay? 1986. This is the granddaddy of all granddaddies of Christian metal releases in the 1980s. Stryper's To Hell with the Devil. The original cover, pictured right here, it was banned by certain stores, specifically certain Christian bookstores, because it had a pentagram as part of the art. Of course, the whole idea was that Satan was being thrown into hell, and the pentagram was part of that persona. But because it was frowned upon by a percentage of the stores they were trying to market it through, they ended up coming up with the alternate cover, which we see here. Interestingly, for a lot of years, I didn't personally know there was an alternate cover, original cover. I always thought it was the black one. Then I remember the first time I saw that, and I was like, oh, okay. But I was already so used to the alternate. I was like, nah, I like what I liked what I had, because you get used to what you have. And then I also think it's so interesting that in recent years, the album covers that Stryper has released bear a real resemblance in style to that original album cover of 1986, don't they? In my research, I heard that Michael Sweet reissued To Hell with the Devil with the original artwork in 2010. So I don't know how prevalent that original artwork was before then, but now you can get it. You know, I'm a college football fan, and trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. In recent years in college football, there's been the cream of the crop. There's been that 1, 2, and 3, and then everybody else. And these teams in maybe 5, 6, and 7, those slots, they're good, but they're markedly different than 1, 2, and 3. And honestly, I kind of look at Stryper's 1986 release and Stryper in some ways in general as being in that elite category in Christian metal. And their 1986 release, To Hell with the Devil, certainly falls into that category. Christian metal is awesome, and I love all the bands, and they're all great. But Stryper, without question, when you're thinking of commercial success and their ability to cross over and impact not only the Christian world, but society, Stryper's in a whole different category, man. To Hell with the Devil went platinum within a fairly short amount of time. Stryper, for a season, dominated MTV, beat out the likes of Van Halen, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Kiss, Def Leppard for the #1 spot with Calling on You. I mean, that's pretty epic stuff right there. I think that's why when I talk to people and they meet me and they learn that I'm a pastor, yada, 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 and we're talking, but they don't think metal, right? You don't look at me and think metal. Maybe with my Stryper shirt you do, but in normal life, you know, or just hanging out with my polo on, you don't think like that. And we start talking music. I go, oh yeah, man, I love metal. And they're like, what? Really? Yeah. Oh, Christian metal. Oh, really? And I start naming, oh, you know, Barren Cross? No, I don't know. Who's Barren Cross? Well, Bloodgood. No, I'm sorry, I haven't heard of Bloodgood. How about Saint? No. Stryper? Oh, yeah, Stryper. I've heard of Stryper. It's like, everybody's heard of them. They just broke down barriers, and their music went places and impacted lives like no other metal band that I know about. And I know that I have a tender spot in my heart for them because in 1986, remember, I hadn't surrendered my life to Christ yet. That didn't come till 1987. And so I wasn't seeking Christ. I was sitting in my family room watching MTV. And where most Christian metal bands weren't necessarily crossing over and coming into secular venues and playing like that. Some were, but not quite to the extent that Stryper was. And in my little mind's eye, I see Stryper as a band that said, hey, we're coming right onto the mainstream stage and we're coming right into your family room, right through MTV, and we're going to sing Calling on You. And we're going to sing To Hell with the Devil. And we're going to sing Free. And we're going to sing The Way. And we're going to sing More Than a Man. And we're going to hit you right between the eyes with the gospel and heavy metal music. And I'm so grateful that Stryper took that approach. I know God's bigger than any particular metal band or any of that, but God used them in my life hugely. In more recent years, in like the early 2000s, POD crossed over and brought the gospel into a more mainstream arena. And we all pray that lots of people heard the gospel and the good news about Jesus through their ministry. And most recently, Skillet are doing that in big ways as well. They're branching out, and they're not watering it down. They're not hiding the name of Jesus in their performances at all. They're just unashamedly saying, we love the Lord, as they rock out. But in many ways, their ability to do that is built on the foundation that Stryper created. Now, here are just some honorable mentions that I had to drop in here as well. Remember to check out my 2019 release, Rock This World, wherever you listen to music. If you know of some epic releases from 1986 that I overlooked, be sure to tell me about them in the comments. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. Keep your eyes on Jesus, man, and I will catch you in the next video.